This video is a review of Part 2 of Lesson 1 in Chapter 5. It deals with the colonies starting to kind of become their own and separate away from England, developing their own culture. One of the factors that greatly influenced our culture in America during these early colonial times was the Great Awakening. The Great Awakening was a Christian revitalization movement that swept the Protestant Europe and British America in the 1730s and 1740s. It resulted from powerful preaching that gave listeners a sense of deep personal revelation of their need for salvation. It pulled attention away from the ritual and ceremony, and it made Christianity intensely personal to the average person by fostering a deep sense of spiritual conviction. It encouraged a commitment to a new standard of personal morality. The Great Awakening forever changed colonial culture. Congregations argued over religious practices and often split apart. New churches and congregations were developed, causing older churches to be divided. New Protestant groups were formed, such as the Baptists, Presbyterians. Some groups welcomed women, African Americans, and Native Americans to practice. Churches gained many new members and forced religious groups to create new colleges, such as Princeton and Brown, in order to train new ministers. Two of the leaders of the Great Awakening in America are seen here on this page, Jonathan Edwards on our left and George Whitefield on our right. In America, the revival really began with Jonathan Edwards in Massachusetts. He delivered powerful sermons that attracted a very large following. Edwards terrified listeners with images of God's anger, but promised that they could be saved if they changed their ways. In 1739, English preacher George Whitefield came to America in order to tour the country. Whitefield was a great open-aired speaker who attracted very large and emotional crowds. He converted countless numbers of people to Christianity. Whitefield was somewhat controversial as he told people who believed they might be predestined for damnation that they could be saved by repenting their sins. Benjamin Franklin was a very enthusiastic supporter of George Whitefield. Franklin rarely attended church, and he certainly didn't subscribe to Whitefield's theology, but he admired Whitefield for exhorting people to worship God through good works. Franklin printed Whitefield's sermons on the front page of his newspaper, the Gazette, and used the power of his press to spread Whitefield's fame. The Great Awakening encouraged ideas of equality and the right to challenge authority. This contributed heavily to the revolutionary fervor of the colonists when they declared independence from England years later. The next focus in the chapter was the Enlightenment, or the Age of Reason. The Enlightenment was a cultural movement of intellectuals in the 18th century, first in Europe and later in the American colonies. Its purpose was to reform society using reason rather than tradition, faith, or revelation, and advance knowledge through science. The Enlightenment originated sometime between 1650 and 1700, and it was sparked by philosophers and scientists such as Baruch Spinoza, John Locke, Voltaire, and Isaac Newton. The first Enlightenment philosopher that we focused on in class was John Locke. He was an English philosopher and physician and regarded as one of the most influential of the Enlightenment thinkers. Locke's writings would later influence Voltaire and Rousseau, as well as the American revolutionaries. His ideas are heavily reflected in the United States Declaration of Independence. Locke believed in the social contract theory. He felt that all people were equal and independent, and everyone had a natural right to defend his life, health, liberty, or possessions. Locke believed that people established a civil society or government to help protect these natural rights. Locke also was an advocate for governmental separation of powers and believed that revolution is not only a right, but an obligation in some circumstances. These ideas had further profound influence on the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States. Our next philosopher was Thomas Hobbes. Hobbes was an English philosopher who focused primarily on political philosophy. His most famous work, with Leviathan, was again about the social contract theory. Hobbes' writings and ideas focus on the fact that legitimate political power must be representative and be based on the consent of the people, meaning that people are willing to be ruled by a certain leader. Hobbes wrote that men are addicted to power because gaining power is the only guarantee of living well. This type of power accumulation creates a state of constant war driven by competition and desire for the same goods. In order to avoid this constant state of war, men seek government as a mean of self-preservation, or the protection of oneself. Man's desire for protection will allow him to cede some of his rights to a sovereign government. Hobbes argues for a strong central government. He writes that the basic human motives are selfish. He believes that men left ungoverned or in their natural state would be in a continuous state of war of all against all. In order to avoid such destructive living, people give up some of their rights, the social contract, to establish a civil society. Society is a population under a sovereign authority, to whom all individuals in that society cede some of the rights for the sake of protections. Finally, Hobbes believed that the government's power is absolute and not subject to the laws of its citizens. The citizens will remain obedient to the king as long as he fulfills the social contract by protecting the rights of the individual. Next, we took a look at Adam Smith. Smith was a Scottish philosopher who had a profound influence on modern economics. He is widely known as the father of modern economics. His most prominent work is known as The Wealth of Nations, which focuses on the free market economy, where the price of a good is determined solely by the supply and demand. Smith argues that the government should take a laissez-faire or a hands-off approach to business. He argued that self-interest guides the most efficient use of resources in the nation's economy. Next, we looked at French philosopher Montesquieu. Montesquieu wrote the book On the Spirit of Laws, which outlined his ideas on how the government would work best. Montesquieu believed in three types of government: a monarchy, a republic, and a despotism. He believed that the government that was elected by the people, or a representative government, was the best form. That's known as a republic. Montesquieu also believed that the best government would be balanced between three groups of officials: an executive who enforced the laws, a parliament that made the laws, and a court system that interpreted the laws. He believed it was important to create separate branches of the government with equal but different powers. This would best ensure liberty to the people being governed. Each branch of the government would limit the power of the other branches, not allowing one branch to become too powerful. As you might guess, Montesquieu was very, very influential in the creation of our form of government that we have under the United States Constitution. Next, we took a look at Voltaire. Voltaire was an Enlightenment writer, historian, and philosopher, famous for his advocacy of civil liberties, including freedom of speech, freedom of expression, free trade, but most importantly, religious tolerance and the separation of church and state. Voltaire was very influential with writers like Thomas Jefferson. And lastly, we had French philosopher Rousseau. Rousseau, in his famous book, The Social Contract, argued that all men are born good, but that society corrupts people. People must enter into a social contract that requires us to recognize a collective goodwill. It represents the common good or the public interest. All citizens should participate and be committed to the good of all, even if it is not in their personal best interest. Living for the common good promotes liberty and equality. Rousseau was very supportive of education. He emphasized allowing free expression and a focus on the environment instead of repressing curiosity in order to produce a well-balanced, free-thinking child. He believed in education for all, not just men. These were our Enlightenment philosophers that we talked about from Europe. Our most well-known Enlightenment philosopher in America was Benjamin Franklin, and we saw the video in class about Franklin and also read about him in our text. Hopefully, this helped you to recall some of the information from Lesson 1. Make sure that you review this prior to the test and take a look at the other videos on Lesson 2 and Lesson 3.